Welcome to We Own It's YouTube channel. If you believe in public services for people, not profit, this is the place to be. Before we get started, please do click on the subscribe button so you get updates about our campaigns and interviews from people like George Monbiot, John McDonnell and Caroline Lucas. I'm here today with Andy Cumbers, who is an academic and author of this book, Reclaiming Public Ownership. Andrew has been writing about public ownership and thinking about public ownership for a very long time, and this book was published in 2012, and now you're working on a new book, The Case for Economic Democracy.
That's right, yep.
Yep, fantastic. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, nice to be here, and just great to be involved with all the work you're doing and the fantastic project you've got in taking public ownership out to the public themselves. It's great.
Thank you, thanks Andy. So you were talking about public ownership in 2012, and you chose to call the book Reclaiming Public Ownership. You didn't use the word renationalisation. What was the thinking behind that?
I think what I really wanted to do with the book was really get people to think about public ownership as a new, very different kind of project to the kinds of state-owned nationalisation we had in the past. The main reason for doing that, the time when I was writing it, there were hardly any mainstream parties, certainly not the Labour Party, on the centre-left across Europe, were even thinking about public ownership as a policy tool or mechanism to sort of deal with some of the problems, big public policy problems that face us. And I thought this was a massive mistake on the part of the left and the centre-left in government, that they weren't prepared even to think about public ownership. So I think one of the problems there was that nationalisation, as the older form of public ownership, had a very bad reputation. A lot of that was unfair, as we can come on to, but it was very successfully portrayed as top-down, very bureaucratic, state-driven, inefficient and ineffective, and actually very distant from the people themselves that public ownership is supposed to serve. That was a bit of a caricature, as we can talk about, but I think it was important for me to say to people, well, actually, the nationalisation we had in the past in the UK, in places like France and across the world, was really a state project run largely by state elites, doing some very good things in terms of public services actually, but it was very, very distant from the people themselves who didn't really have much control or stake over what public ownership was about, what should it be for, how should it be run, what kind of strategic goals should public ownership deliver, and I wanted to write a book to say, well, actually, the idea of public ownership is a really good idea, that if we have critical public services that everybody needs and requires, surely the public should own them, and more than that, they should be involved in a more democratic and participatory way in deciding how those public services should be run. I always make the point that you want experts and you want people who know what they're doing running and managing companies, but that doesn't mean that's not mutually exclusive to having the public involved in them. So the whole idea about the book was to sort of say, well, let's relook at public ownership, and let's also look at in other parts of the world where they've had different forms of public ownership that have worked actually pretty well, and where public ownership is still very popular. And let's try to think about a very different form and model of public ownership of the 21st century that compared to the nationalisation models that we've had in the past, because I think that there's a growing awareness, and I think your work really has identified this really, really well. There's a growing awareness that privatisation in all its forms is not working, and there's lots of different reasons for that. So we need a different way of running public services if we're going to create sustainable public services, but also if we're going to deal with some of the massive problems like tackling climate change, tackling things like fuel poverty, and access, decent access to water, electricity, and so on. Yeah,
fantastic. And so you looked at what happened in the past, the nationalisations that have been critiqued as being too top down. To what extent do you think public ownership was successful in the past, and to what extent do you think there are things to be learned about how to do it better?
Yeah. If you go back to the 1930s, before we had the nationalisation program in the 1940s, what you've got to remember is Britain, if we're talking about Britain, was a very different place. So a lot of people didn't have secure water supplies. They didn't have decent electricity or gas and so on. They certainly didn't have affordable healthcare. So if we think about the expansion of public ownership in the 1940s and 50s, as also including things like the health service, the welfare state, it was part of a broader project really to improve the lives of the ordinary person, working class people, or ordinary citizens. And you have to say, in terms of building nationwide electricity grids where everybody had access to electricity, in terms of providing energy and energy supplies, putting in a national grid and system for supply of energy, gas, oil, and so on. It did a really good job. Nationalisation actually it took cheap, affordable services to the average user, the average citizen across the UK. It's also worth saying that many of the, contrary to what the privatisation exponents say, the nationalised industries, many of them were actually quite effective and quite productive. There was a very good study done by some academics at Leeds University in the late 1990s that compared the productivity of the big nationalised sectors like electricity, gas, and water and so on in the UK, and they compared them with private sector counterparts in the US, and they found actually they were actually more productive over a 20-year period from the 50s to 1970s. A lot of the things that had been written about nationalisation in the 1970s and 80s was actually about nationalisations that were carried out over that period in a very kind of frantic, rushed way. It was often nationalisation of the car industry, nationalisation of the shipbuilding industry, which was done as a last resort measure by governments to really try to bail out failing industries. And it's worth saying that those failing industries were actually in private hands. And the fault for those failures was largely to do with the management of those industries and underinvestment over a long-term period. So what tended to get lumped together in the 1970s was those kind of short-term, immediate nationalisations of these kind of consumer industries which were failing, with these other utility sectors. And in fact, the context and the circumstances were very different. But I think what the Conservatives did very, very well, you have to say that in the 70s and 80s, is they painted this narrative of this broader vision of nationalisation that was failing, removed from citizens, and basically was inefficient. But it's clearly far from the mark in terms of what was really going on. And the other interesting thing I say to people is that if you look at British Rail, which actually up until the 1980s there was underinvestment, and it was systematically run down by all governments actually. So the network wasn't really upgraded and modernised in the way that it was, for example, in France or in Germany. If you look at British Rail, and of course the idea then was that we're going to move to a car-based society. They were building all the money was going into motorways and so on. So there was, they'd had the beaching cuts of the 60s, of course, running down the railways. This was, of course, before climate change changed the dynamics there. But I think there was a good report done by some academics at the University of Manchester, and they said that actually if you looked at the comparative experience across Europe, despite all that lack of investment in British Rail, on the operating level, the railways in the UK were running as efficiently as any other railway in Europe in the early 1980s. And that's quite amazing, because you talk to journalists and they say, oh, we don't want to go back to the old bad old days of the British Rail, and usually the best thing they can do is talk about the sandwiches.
Yeah, exactly. The soggy sandwiches.
And that's just superficial.
Yeah.
And I say to them, okay, so now you go to a railway station, you got a great consumer choice about what you eat when you're at the station, but your train might not run.
Shame about the trains. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think you've made those points as well.
Yeah, definitely. So actually, the evidence doesn't stack up, but there was a really strong narrative being pushed to say that it wasn't working. And so, but do you think that there are things that public ownership should have done better in the past that we need to do better now? I think public ownership should have been more accountable. It should have been more transparent in terms of how it was governed. There were lots of decisions taken behind closed doors. So, for example, the decision to go towards nuclear energy in the 1950s and 60s was made by senior civil servants and politicians. Actually, I think it probably the Conservatives at the time. But there was very little public debate about the direction of energy policy, for example. And we're living with the consequences now in terms of an inherited system of nuclear power, which is massively expensive. It's going to be hugely expensive to actually decommission. And you think about the opportunity cost of the money that's going into there as opposed to where it could have gone. Yeah, and I suppose you can compare that to what you talk about happening in Norway, where they managed the oil in a very collective way, and there was a debate that happened in the country about how do we use this resource for the common good.
Yeah, well, what happened in Norway when they discovered North Sea oil? I've written a lot in the past about the comparisons between North Sea oil in the UK and Norway. Norway's really interesting because actually, if you look at what happened, they discovered oil around about the same time as we did in the 1960s. And because Norway's a smaller country of perhaps 4 million compared to us, oil was a much bigger deal in Norway than it was here, quite clearly, although it did become a bigger deal here eventually. But I think because of that, there was a massive debate within Norwegian society about, well, what do we do with all this oil? How do we run it properly? And out of that debate, there was a decision to set up their own oil company, Statoil. And I think it's worth saying that the country's elite politicians and civil servants would have been quite happy if this was a sort of standard top-down nationalised entity. And that's the way they set it up. You know, they set it up with a board that was largely top-down. There wasn't a lot of public engagement. But the public didn't like this, and I think the Norwegian Parliament basically mobilised to say, well, actually, we can't allow this company to become this big oil and energy company and to dictate affairs. We need countervailing institutions and mechanisms to kind of hold Statoil to account. So Statoil became a reasonably top-down company, but what you got to remember in Norway is because they have very strong employment relations laws, the board of Statoil had to have employee representatives, so that's worth saying. But it was going to be a relatively top-down model. But then what the Parliament did, there was various debates in the Parliament about what to do with Statoil, and it was agreed that Statoil should have to report to the Parliament, to different committees in the Parliament, and basically it had to be transparent about what it was doing, and it had to give an account of itself to Parliament every year or every so often. The other thing that happened is Norwegians educated themselves about oil, all aspects to do with oil, the legal, the technical, the environmental aspects, and you saw civil society in a way bringing skills and knowledge that they'd already had in different professions and sectors and apply that experience to oil. So there was a massive public debate about oil in the way that it just didn't happen, I think, here, and that's really interesting. And as a result of that, I think there was a much slower, gradualist approach to oil production. For example, Norwegian history actually is replete with ideas that natural resources also should be for the benefit of the whole of society. And that goes back to the 19th century when Norway had a lot of water resources, and they got foreign companies in to help them exploit it, but there was always a check on the role that foreign companies would play. And that was kind of taken forward into the oil industry, which was of course dominated by the US multinationals, to say, well, actually we need to develop our own expertise, our own knowledge, our own experience. And they spent billions of krona in terms of knowledge, training, research and development, some of which were never had any applied benefits. But I think what it did is it created this incredible level of technology expertise. And the one other thing they did was they created a separate petroleum directorate in Norway. That's very
interesting.
So you had a state oil company, but you had a petroleum directorate that could be independent of the oil company and could develop its own knowledge, experience, and could decide what it wanted to invest in and research. And I think a big part of the arguments I make is that we don't want to just have a very democratic, decentralized forms of public ownership, but we need a decentered model of governance where you don't allow one institution or one body to become all powerful in terms of knowledge, experience and networks and so on.
Really interesting. And I guess obviously we need to be moving away from oil, but it's such an interesting example of governance, and actually it kind of links into what we're calling for in our recent report of a body for the people who use public services to hold government to account for providing those public services and kind of having that checks and balances in the system and having that balance in the system.
The key thing is that these things are properly funded and they are seen as part of governance. They're not kind of some sort of citizens body that's kind of out there on their own and relying on people volunteering their time and always at a disadvantage against the insider experts within the industry. So I think that's what I take away from the Norway model, is actually having this kind of countervailing body that really can represent the citizens, but has the resources to do its own research or to do its own, and I think that's important for democracy. We shouldn't just have one body doing all the research and saying, well, these are the answers, but we should have different sources of expertise that might say, well, this is an alternative way of doing things. And that's not to say you should have 1,000 flowers bloom and complete chaos where everybody's coming up with their own models, but you need to have a debate. At some point you need to make a decision about how you move forward, and you need to get people behind that. But I think you need that alternative, competing sort of centres of knowledge and expertise to develop.
Yeah, and I guess that leads to the question of, we talk about public ownership, and I know you define public ownership in a very broad way, but there are other kinds of ownership in terms of worker ownership, cooperative ownership, community ownership, and obviously sort of more narrow state ownership, depending how you define them. Do you think there are kind of principles that we can think about in terms of when these different forms of ownership should be in operation.
Yeah, I mean, the key thing in my book is there's no one model of public ownership, state ownership. I think if you look at the failings of the attempts to create socialism in one country, in the Soviet Union, and across that kind of the Soviet bloc, and also probably in China during the Cold War period, I think one of the problems is they had this one model of state ownership. The state would own things on behalf of the people. We were working for the people. And I think what that actually did, interestingly, if you look at the experience, it actually got rid of a lot of interesting cooperative traditions and mutualist traditions that were already present in society. And I think, again, if you have one big monolithic owner of everything, again, for me, that's not going to create democracy. It's not going to create debate. It's not going to help you in terms of developing alternative knowledges and ideas and questioning the status quo. Not that we should always go against the status quo, but we should have alternative ways and sources of doing things. So I think pluralism and ownership, if you think about the economy as a whole, is actually critically important. And also I would say that some sectors lend themselves to different forms of ownership, for example. So when I first started talking about public ownership back in the 1990s and 2000s, when I was about the only person that seemed to be, I was talking to myself probably, but I remember going around and people said, well, would you nationalise fish and chip shops? And clearly not. I think the reason I use a broader definition of public ownership, because I see public ownership as about collective ownership, and the reason I have a broader definition is because I think the big problem we have is that private ownership creates certain inequalities and forms, and it basically encourages a small group of people. If you allow private ownership to gather control, it allows a small group of people to control all the capital, the resources, and so on, and basically exploit the labour of others. But also, if these companies then acquire big monopolistic positions, they massively exploit consumers. As your work shows. So, what I think we need to return to is the idea of collective ownership being actually pretty critical. That's not to say you would extinguish private ownership completely. I think there's a role for people still having the ability to have an idea and set up their own firms and run with things. But one of the things I think we might want to think about is whether, when a firm gets to a certain size, should it turn itself into a cooperative or an employee ownership? Because surely above a certain size, it becomes a shared collective endeavour. Yes. And if one person or group of people are the ones who are benefiting with all the profits and extracting the revenues that are coming out of it at the expense of everybody else, I would say that's an infringement on the rights of everybody else. So I think, if you think about public ownership as economic democracy, we need to question whether private ownership as a kind of dominant model is the right thing, and whether we can extend forms of public ownership into different sectors. So I think a lot of consumer sectors, where you could imagine they're becoming much more dominated by cooperative models or employee ownership models, the John Lewis models. Yeah. Having said that, there are other sectors that are natural monopolies, and for me, there are limits to how much you would want cooperatives running in those sectors in a kind of market-based system. I still think there is a role for the state, but that could be a more democratic form of state than we have at the moment. The other thing I would say, actually, the Soviet Union is much maligned, but there was a really good book written in the 1980s by a guy called Alex Nove, who is a kind of Soviet studies economist at the University of Glasgow, funnily enough. And he said, he basically pointed out that actually if you looked at the energy sector in the Soviet Union, it was pretty efficient, or even steel. Because if you're looking at basic things that don't need a lot of consumer interaction, you just want to produce things that are important things for people to have for their everyday needs, whether it's water, energy, probably railways were a natural monopoly as well. But a lot of these sectors in the Soviet Union were run pretty well. Yeah. I mean, if he compared the oil sector in the Soviet Union in the 1980s, and he said actually that was running just as well as the oil sector, right, under capitalism outside the Soviet Union. Yeah. But of course, you didn't have the market fluctuations. Yeah.
And, to some extent, people might not want to participate. Some people are going to want to, others won't want to participate in services like water or energy. Some people will be happy for water to come out of the tap and energy to be, affordable and renewable, and that's it.
Yeah, and that's always an argument that's made against taking things back into public ownership. Why should people care? And it's the sort of arguments that Tony Blair and New Labour made. People don't care where they get their hospitals or where they get their schools from, as long as they get the services. And so that they went down the private finance route, and we know what happened as a result of that. That's an argument. It's a very potent argument. But I think people do care when they see the quality of their services declining, but the prices are going up.
Yeah, and they have no power to do anything about it.
And that's often when people get energized and do start to ask bigger questions.
Exactly.
I would also say against the idea that people don't want to get involved. I think that the experience when people are given the chance suggests otherwise. It suggests actually people do get involved. If you look at the really interesting stuff that's gone around participatory budgeting in Latin America, for example, where they've done very radical versions of that, where a place like Porto Alegre, where they've given over quite big chunks of the state budget to local residents, you do get massive participation. And interestingly, you get participation from women and lower income groups that are often marginalised from decision making otherwise.
So it's disproportionate participation by those groups.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fantastic. You also talk in the book about Denmark and how the state works really closely with local co-ops for wind power. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about how that works and what maybe we could learn from it here in the UK?
Yeah, well I think, and I've written a little bit about this more recently in different pamphlets, but what happened in Denmark between about 1980 and 2000 is you had a remarkable kind of revolution or transformation in their energy sector and the whole way they did things. Before the 1980s, they got most of their energy from oil. In fact, and that was all imported oil. Mm-hmm. And although Denmark has discovered some North Sea oil, and it does have its own very small supplies. There was a big debate as there was right across Europe when you had the big oil price hikes of the 1970s. There was a big debate across Europe in particular because most of the oil before North Sea oil was imported. A big debate about energy security. What do we do now? And the elites in Denmark wanted to go towards nuclear power as the option, as they did in Germany and France and Britain to some extent. But there was a massive debate, and I think what was interesting there was an older tradition, a grassroots tradition of having your own energy powered by wind. Very small, but it was nevertheless something that was very live in Denmark. And Denmark has a very decentralized structure of its utilities, so it didn't have the nationalization that we had, where everything came under one, a few big companies, but it still had a very decentralized grid. It still had local authorities running electricity companies and so on. So it had that decentralized tradition. And what happened as a result of that big debate in the 1970s? There was a kind of a radical reaction against nuclear power. And you had all kinds of rural groups getting together with more radical green and left groups to say, well, actually, we want to explore an alternative. And they pushed the state basically to reject nuclear power and go for this decentralized, or certainly explore renewable energy as an alternative. And things like district heating became very important as well in Denmark. So what the state then did in the 1980s is they developed various mechanisms, some of which are now being used globally, like feed-in tariffs, to encourage and stimulate renewable energy, which at the time would have been more expensive. But they basically gave them massive guaranteed prices to produce energy as a way of incentivizing them. And in the 1990s in particular, there was a massive growth of renewable energy wind turbines. But the other interesting thing that the state did, and again this ties into longer traditions in Scandinavia of the community having a role in things. The other thing they did is they set up local ownership conditions for ownership of wind turbines. I can't remember exactly how it worked, but you had to live in the municipality, or if you wanted to own a wind turbine. And interestingly, what that did is it encouraged families to get together to create cooperatives. Mm-hmm. And Denmark already had a very strong rural cooperative tradition. Many of the big Danish agricultural firms that you've probably heard about, people wouldn't realise are still cooperatives. There was that big rural cooperative tradition. So people got together and basically created cooperatives because they could then produce things on a bigger scale to sell into the grid. And basically the state had various taxes and policies and subsidies that encouraged this to happen. So what you had is you had state intervention at the national level to encourage a kind of localized form of collective ownership. And I wouldn't say that the Danish model's perfect, because if you look at what happens in Denmark, it was often the middle class rural people who could afford
That's the risk, isn't it?
Capital to set up co-ops, And the danger is that, and I think this was one of the things that became a live issue in Danish politics in the 2000s. The danger is that you create all these subsidies for renewable energy. The electricity prices of the ordinary consumer go up as a result, and they're saying, well, actually, how are we benefiting from this? You're basically funding middle class rural groups to benefit. So there's always a tension there, I think, in that. But I mean, there are ways around that. And I know on the island of Samso, which is a very small island that's 100% renewable, They did actually have sort of financial schemes where lower income people could borrow money to invest in a co-op, and then it would be once it was paid off over time. Okay. So there are ways around that, I think, but it's a very different kind of model of how you might do a democratic collective public ownership.
Yeah. Which I guess, it's great if there's a balance between these different forces and if communities are part of public ownership. But, you say here we mustn't write off the state in favour of just doing it ourselves, because actually the people who can do it ourselves are often middle class people and, maybe people with time on their hands. And so can you speak just a little bit more about, why we don't want co-ops doing everything, why we think that the role of the state is important?
Yeah, I think it's two big things about the role of the state. The first is exactly that point. The state is the kind of the backstop for universal protection of every citizen. That's kind of its role. People forget that. So as part of that, it still needs to have that kind of overarching role as the authority, as the body that ensures that everybody is, as far as possible, is treated equally, and therefore that I think if you left things to an economy of cooperatives or employee ownership, it might be better than what we have at the moment, and those organisations might be run on better values. But there's a danger that you would create new elites that would marginalise people that aren't in employment or don't have the income to take part in cooperatives. So I think the state still has that kind of backstop role. The other thing is I think there, as I say, there are limits to what the market can do, particularly in sectors that are natural monopolies. So I'm very clear that the energy sector, most of it should be taken back into the grid distribution networks. Most of that should be under state control. Some of it could be under local state control. We could still have cooperatives that supply power and generation to the grid. But I think you need overall coordination in that sector. The market doesn't belong in the energy sector, for example. So that's one thing. So that the first point is it's about inequality and providing the state having that duty really to look after its citizens universally. And then the second point really relates to the way that the state, 3 points I'm thinking about. The second point is there are certain sectors that do need state planning and coordination, and we need to return to the idea of national planning is not a bad thing. That went out the window in the 1980s as well, I think, with Thatcherism, the whole idea of planning, long-term planning, and actually you see other countries like Germany and Holland in particular, where planning is still a very important part of the culture, and it has to be because it's a very densely populated country.
And it can be collective planning as well. The public can be involved in that.
Yeah. So three things: equity. Particular sectors should be run. They are natural monopolies, and they need to have quite a lot of state control. You can have different hybrid forms of ownership within it. And then I think the third thing is the one thing the state can do, and we need to say this, again and again and again. The state can borrow and it can invest for the long term in a way that the private sector won't.
Yeah.
And we've got plenty of examples with privatisation now of we've done the experiment, if you like. We know that doesn't work. Energy is the classic example. You're going to need, probably hundreds of billions of pounds to transform our current energy sector over to a sort of post-carbon one, and we know it's an urgent imperative. The only body in society that's capable of doing that level of investment over the longer term is the state. And if you look at the private sector, and this isn't an anti-private sector point actually, the private sector is there to make a profit. It's not interested in investing, for 30 or 40 years. It needs to make upwards of 6%, if you like, if you're a PLC or even more, satisfy your investors. It's just not. It's not the private model is not the model to undertake short, longer term patient investment for the kind of thing you need if you're going to modernise your infrastructure. The state's the only body that can do that. I'll give you a really nice example of that. In Germany, they have a development bank which was actually set up in the 1940s as part of the Marshall Plan to kind of reconstruct Europe. The KfW it's called, and local authorities, local energy companies in Germany can borrow quite big sums of money from them to invest in renewables or in smarter heating systems, and they can do it at less than 1% over a 20-year period.
Yeah.
That's a massive financial. That tells you about the massive financial anchoring that the state can potentially do.
Yeah. So how do you think in the energy sector, how could we democratise the national grid?
Yeah. Well, the national grid is something that should be run and owned at the state level, higher level, by the government, with the public involved. Okay, it's one of those things that needs long-term strategic investment and modernisation. So you wouldn't, that's the sort of thing I think where you would want that in fairly clearly in state forms of public ownership. But that's not to say that you couldn't have a body that was set up that was more democratically accountable than we've had in the past. So for example, you could have a structure of the governance board that has European co-determination principles, where you could have a third of the directors are appointed by government, which, let's not forget, government is democratically elected, so it's at arm's length. But then a third could be employee representatives that are elected, and then the other third could come from the management of the company, and then you'd have a separate management board that was responsible for the operational management. But even that so you could have a governance body, but then an operational body. But you
what
might
about putting users.
Well, yeah, you might. I would say you might want a separate. That's where I would say the idea of a separate citizens body, which the company would have to report to, the Norwegian model, or even what they're doing with some French water companies now. In Paris, where they've taken the water, which was privatised, they've taken the water sector back under public control. They've set up a citizens' assembly.
Yeah.
So you could, although I don't think that has as much power to actually hold the company to account, but nevertheless the company is legally required to be transparent and accountable. So the national grid, because it is going to be spending vast sums of our money and so on, you can make it accountable through some kind of citizens body or an assembly. And a lot of people would say, well, you're creating lots of layers of organisation and bureaucracy, but in a way we already have those with the privatised sector. We have all these regulators and so on that have been created because people realised that market failure was a reality. So I think instead of having that, why not have these sort of citizens assemblies or bodies, which the company like National Grid it would still have its governance structure of one third to give it some kind of democratic role for employees alongside management and the state. But then you could have this separate body which the National Grid would be required to produce an annual report about its operations to, which could then be scrutinised. Whether you would then give that body powers to charge the National Grid to do things is an interesting question. But I do. The other thing I think about these new forms of public ownership, they need to have clear value statements driving them, mission statements driving them, that are very different from the commercial ones that they perhaps operated under before. That's the other thing to say about older forms of state ownership. They were nationalisation. They were largely expected to just be commercial entities and kind of run efficiently and effectively according to market and commercial norms. And there's nothing wrong with being effective and not wasting money. But that's a very different thing to asking a company to just operate on normal commercial values and norms.
So the tripartite system is one way of doing it, but you could have energy users and communities on the National Grid supervisory board. So you could have consumers effectively, or citizens, which is a better word, trained up on how the energy industry works, and maybe other bodies like people like Citizens Advice, or people who are working on climate change.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing stopping you having a what would you call that? Not tripartite, but quadra. Right. But yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a problem with that, and I think you could have elected user representatives and consumers. I mean, actually, the French nationalised inders in the 1940s, they actually did have user representatives on them when they were first set up.
And how did that go?
Enough. I think it went well. It depends who you read, and I think that. I think it meant that the model, I think naturalisation became a much more stronger feature of French society and accepted, if you like, because but also there was very strong worker representation on those. The Communist Party in France had quite a big role in the setting up of French nationalised governance structures. So there was a big role for workers. There was co-determination. So it went okay, but over time, those enterprises did become captured by state elites, I would say. Yeah. So the thing I would say here is that yes, you can have citizens representatives and you can have workers representatives, but there is always a danger that they get co-opted into broader projects. They become too friendly with the other parts of management. They become too if the workers and the consumer representatives are only in a part-time role, whereas the managerial representatives are the one that've got the full-time role, that know what's going on and have the knowledge and expertise, and it's their day job and so on, there is always a danger of a power imbalance on those boards. That's why I think an additional kind of consumer body like the ones you're talking about is quite a good idea. I think, to try to put that balance. I mean, the reality is, you've got to accept that nothing is going to be perfect, and democracy is only as good as the citizens and the workers and our ability to remain active and contest things and challenge them. But I think you can see how you can put institutional structures in place that will encourage greater debate, negotiation, contestation of what's going on, for the good of the enterprise as well as everything else, than systems that become very, very quickly captured by elite groups and particular politicians and very short-termist agendas, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what do you think should be the balance between the national, regional and local, because obviously they all interrelate and they've all got a strategic element, but how do you see that? Obviously the national level is important, but the other levels are just as important in different ways.
Yeah, it's a bit of a cop-out, but but it will depend upon sectors and industries and what is technically feasible and what works in terms of the efficient running of what's the old economics term, the minimum efficient scale for things. So there are things that will clearly, the energy sector, I think there's a lot of talk about or we can move to a very decentralised sector with lots of co-ops and community. I think that's a dangerous route to travel down, because as I've said, the energy needs national strategic planning. Arguably you need European level strategic public ownership if you're going to integrate all the different bits of the. Energy. If you think about renewables integrating with base sources of energy like hydroelectric power and so on, it's almost a continental-wide project if you want to think of it in those terms. Yeah. A lot of the big issues we face, I think, in the future are continental, macro-regional. They're continental. Yeah. So I think whatever your opinion on Brexit in the EU, we do need, if we're gonna for example realise the real benefits Scotland has in its massive renewable resources, that needs interconnectors into Scandinavia, which I think they're building at the moment. It needs interconnectors with the rest of the UK and into Europe as well. So I think a lot of the things that we're talking about need macro-regional level strategic integration. That's not to say that you couldn't still have elements of it that are run locally and decentralised. So, for example, within the energy sector, I think a lot of issues for a lot of towns and cities is whether they could run a local distribution grid themselves rather than in private hands. And I think that does happen in parts of Germany, where there's a local distribution grid and network that's owned by the local authority, but there's still an overall national grid and framework. So I'm in favour of devolving power wherever you can and self-govern at the lowest level. But I think we have to recognise that you still need this higher level national integrated planning. But as I've said, you can still democratise that, although recognise that you might need different vehicles to democratise it than you would have at the local level. The railways is interesting, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you clearly need integration across the network. And that's one of the big problems of privatisation with the way that John Major did it. He had this vision of the 1920s and 30s, Great Western Railway and everything. And that clearly didn't work. But on the other hand, there's clearly lots of integrated transport systems at the local level that you probably would want run locally under local public ownership and control. So I think it does differ. My preference as a sort of somebody who's driven by economic democracy is to devolve things as far as possible. But as far as possible is the key key term there, isn't it?
What are your 3 favourite public services?
Well, National Health Service. You've only got to go abroad I would say the Scottish National Health Service, because I think
it's much better, isn't it?
The Scottish National Health Service, because I think that's still run on the principles of universalism. There's limited market infringement. It's still mainly one body. And of course, it's the most loved service in the UK because it does an incredible job, even with various reforms and attempts to privatise bits of it. It still provides that universal service, which you only have to be in another country. Even some of the European ones where they don't have the level of universal care that we have, that you see what an amazing service it is, and you see what universal public owned services can actually do. You've asked me for 3, haven't you? That's a difficult one. I think Scottish Water is run pretty well because, again, sorry for being parochial, but I think if you compare how that's run compared to the the private water companies. You've only got to look at the lack of debt in that sector. Having said that, it's still quite a top-down organisation, so it could be democratised a bit further along the lines we were talking about. And in terms of a third one, again, if I can be a bit, can I go outside the UK?
Of course.
I quite like Amtrak. Yeah, if you're going to talk about the US public rail system. And the amazing thing about Amtrak is it survived a really harsh attempt to underfund it and starve it of funds in the 1970s under Nixon, and it clearly wasn't Reagan's favourite service either. But I think it's just a classic example of how you can still have a relatively popular public services even in the most free enterprise economy. I think does a pretty amazing job given its lack of funding over the years.
Yeah. I was absolutely thrilled to go on that Amtrak train in the US recently.
Yeah,
I was
great,
checking it out, publicly owned train in America.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Andrew. Really great to be talking about this with you.
Yeah.
So many interesting points.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and do read this book if you haven't. This is Andrew's 2012 book, but there's another one coming soon.
And actually, a lot of the arguments I make in here are extended in that book because the whole point about public ownership is it doesn't mean anything unless it's part of a broader project for economic democracy.
Yeah, and people can follow you on Twitter?
They can, although I'm not a great Twitter user, but yes, they can follow me on Twitter.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for watching. Please do let us know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, you can like, share and subscribe to us here on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/WeOwnItCampaign. You can catch up with us on Twitter at @we_ownit, or you can follow me at @Hobbs, and you can follow us on Instagram at @WeOwnIt_campaign. If you support public ownership, the most important thing you can do is to sign up for our newsletter by clicking on the link in the description below. We need you with us so we can win campaigns and get public services for people, not profit.